Welcome to my class. In this particular video session, we will talk about entity relationship model. ER model. Dr. Peter Chan. The entity relationship ER model was introduced by Peter Chan in 1976. This model is based on the perception of real world that is made of number of first entities, that is objects, second attributes, that is characteristics or features, and the third one is the relationship among them. About ER model. ER model is a data model that is used to design relational databases. Peter Chan introduced not only the ER model but also corresponding diagramming techniques, that is ER diagrams. It is easy to transform ER diagrams to relational data model. ER model makes use of number of components such as the first one is entity, the second one is attributes, and the third one is relationships. So ER model makes use of these three components: first entity, second attributes, and the third one is relationships. Now what is the meaning of entity? Peter Chan defined an entity as a thing which can be easily identified. Anything which can be easily identified is an entity. Entity may be an object like bulb. An entity may be a place like Taj Mahal. Third, an entity may be a person like doctor. Entity may be a concept, for example, green thinking. An entity may be an activity. Here kids are doing some activity on the table. So entity may be an object, a place, a person, a concept, or an activity about which an organization records data. Again, an entity may be an object, place, person, concept, or an activity about which an organization records data. In case we are designing a database for the College of Delhi University, then entities are first objects, computers, projectors, chairs, tables, etc. Second place, classroom, library, canteen, conference hall, etc. Third person, student, teachers, head of department, non-teaching staff, etc. Fourth concept, different courses like BCom honors, BCom program, etc. Fifth activity. The first example of activity is admission, fee collection, examination, and it can be annual function, etc. Entity representation. In ER diagram, entity is represented by a named rectangular box. For example, teacher. Teacher is an entity and it is represented by named rectangular box. The named rectangular box is teacher. We have given a name to this rectangular box. Entities can be understood in two ways: on the basis of types, on the basis of dependencies. On the basis of types, there are two types of entities, that is entity type and entity instance. Entity type is a set of things which share common properties, for example student and course. These are the example of entity type. An entity type is denoted by uppercase alphabets. For example, student and course. Entity instance An entity instance is a specific individual, thing or object. For example, individual student is Amit and individual course is BCom Honors. An entity instance is usually depicted in lower or mixed case alphabets. For example, Amit and BCom Honors. These both are example of entity instance. On the basis of dependencies, there are two types of entities, dependent entity and independent entity. Dependent entity, an entity whose existence depends on the existence of another entity, is termed as dependent entity. They are also termed as weak entities. Independent entity, the existence of an independent entity does not depend on the existence of other entity. Independent entities are also termed as regular entities. Now the representation of dependent and independent. The dependent entity is represented in a double-line rectangular box and connected to the independent entity by a line. For example, the existence of entity subject depends on the entity course opted by the student. So course is independent entity, whereas subject is dependent entity. Attributes. Meaning of attributes. An attribute refers to the characteristics or property of a given entity. Attribute is depicted as an ellipse and labeled with the name of the property. This is ellipse and we will write down the name of the attribute. Classification of attributes. Basically, there are two types of attributes, that is attribute type and attribute instance. However, other types of attributes are also there. Attribute type. An attribute type is property of entity type. First example, enrollment number, name, address and course are the examples of attributes of an entity type student. We will represent it like this. Entity type student has attribute type, which are enrollment number, name, address and course. Attribute instance. An attribute instance is a particular property of an entity instance. For example, enrollment number is 101, name is Amit, address is A-22 Rohini and course is BCom Honors. These are the examples of attributes of an entity instance. We will represent it like this. Here student is entity instance and the attributes of entity instance are 101, that is enrollment number, Amit, that is name, A-22 Rohini, that is address and course BCom Honors. These are the examples of attributes of an entity instance. Second example. Attribute type is a property of entity type. Here entity type is teacher and the attributes of entity type is teacher ID, name, address, department. We represent it like this. All these are examples of attributes of an entity type teacher. Attribute instance. An attribute instance is a particular property of an entity instance. That is teacher ID 1001, name Rajiv, address A-2- Murder department is commerce. These are the examples of attributes of an entity instance. We can represent it like this. These are the attributes of entity instance teacher. Other types of attributes. According to value, single valued. A single valued attribute can accept only a single value. For example, the attribute marital status can accept only one value, either a person is married or unmarried. It cannot have other than these two attributes. Multi-valued attributes. A multi-valued attribute can accept more than one value for an attribute. For example, the attribute age can accept multiple values for different instances. According to structure, we have simple attribute, we have composite attribute. Simple attribute. A simple attribute cannot be subdivided. For example, the attribute gender, it cannot be divided into smaller independent attributes. It can be only male or female. The male and female attribute cannot be further divided into smaller independent attributes. Composite attribute. The composite attributes are those attributes which can be further subdivided into smaller independent usable attributes. For example, the age attribute can accept values in completed years. The age attribute can further be divided into completed years, completed months, and days. According to dependency. Dependency defined. Sometimes two or more attributes of an entity may relate to each other in such a way that one attribute is totally independent, whereas the other attribute or attributes may become dependent on that attribute. The independent attribute is termed as basic or stored attribute, and the dependent attribute is termed as derived attribute. Therefore, according to dependency, there are two types of attributes, that is stored and derived. Stored attributes. The value of basic attribute which needs to be stored as it is directly is termed as stored attribute. Derived attribute. The value of the attribute that is dependent on some independent attribute is termed as derived attribute. Let's have a look at the examples of stored and derived attribute. Let us take the salary of an employee in an organization. The salary of employee consists of number of components. The first one is basic pay, then dearness allowance, HRA, house rent allowance, etc. Let's assume basic pay is 50,000. Dearness allowance is 20% of the basic pay. HRA, house rent allowance, is equal to 30% of the basic pay. This information is given in a table named as employee salary. Employee salary table. These are the names of the employees A, B, C, D. This is the basic pay of employee A. Basic pay, that is 50,000, multiplied by 20%, it comes to 10,000. It means the employee A gets DA, that is rupees 10,000. Employee A gets HRA, that is 30% of basic pay, and it comes to 15,000. Now, what is stored attribute and what is derived attribute? We have written basic pay as it is. We have stored this figure as it is, so this is termed as stored attribute. We derived the figure of DA and HRA on the basis of basic pay. Then these will be termed as derived attribute. In this case, the value of attribute basic pay is stored as it is. Then this is termed as stored attribute. Whereas the value of attribute dearness allowance and house rent allowance is calculated as some percentage of value of attribute basic pay. Then this will be termed as derived attribute. Here the value of attributes dearness allowance and HRA, house rent allowance, are derived 1. Therefore, dearness allowance and house rent allowance in the employee salary table are termed as derived attributes. Now what is key attribute? Key attribute is an attribute of an entity that contains unique values for every entity instance. It is used to identify a particular record in a table. It is defined by assigning primary key to it. We will assign that this particular field, this particular attribute is primary one. So we say that we have assigned primary key to this attribute. For example, the attribute enrollment number of a student in a student table is an example of key attribute because the enrollment number of every student has to be unique. Now, after having discussed different types of attributes of an entity, it is essential to know that an entity may have different types of attributes. The different types of attribute of an entity are represented differently as shown in the following diagram. If we want to represent single value attribute, then we will represent it by ellipse. Key attribute is represented like this. In the ellipse we have a line. The derived attribute, it consists of dotted oval. Multi-valued attribute, it consists of two ovals. An entity shall be represented like this. These are some of the symbols used to represent entity, attributes and relationship. Relationships. Peter Chan defined relationship as an association among entities. Relationship representation. How do we represent a relationship? A relationship is depicted by a diamond box with the name of relationship. We have a named relationship. Classification of relationship. There are two types of relationship. One is relationship type and the second is relationship instance. A relationship type is an association of entity types. Here an association between two entities, teacher and student, is represented by a relationship named as teaches. We have two entities, we have two entity types. One is teacher, second is student. These are two entity types. And in this case, the relationship is represented by this diamond box. We named this diamond box as teaches. So, we can define this relationship as teacher teaches student. Relationship instance. A relationship instance is an association of entity instances. Rajiv is teacher and Amit is student. These two are Rajiv and Amit, these two are entity instances, and there is a relationship between these two entity instances, and the name of the relationship is teaches. So Rajiv teaches Amit. Now we have learned entity, we have learned attributes and relationship. Let's combine the concept of entity, attributes and relationship diagrammatically as shown below. Classification of attributes. First example. Attribute type is a property of entity type. Enrollment number, name, address and course are example of attributes of an entity type student. We will represent that diagrammatically like this. Attribute type. An attribute type is property of entity type. Second example. Now teacher. Teacher has got different attributes. Teacher is an example of entity type. The different attribute of entity types are teacher ID, name, address and department. We represent like this. So here we have represented two different entity types. One is teacher and the second is student. Let's combine the concept of entity type, attribute type and relationship type diagrammatically as shown below. Teacher is an entity. These are the attributes of entity type. Similarly, student is an entity. These are the attributes of entity type. We will have a relationship between teacher entity and student entity. We call this thing as relationship type. Now we are going to create a relationship teacher teaches student. In this particular diagram, you can see that two entity types are having relationship. Now let us combine the concept of entity instance, attribute instance and relationship instance diagrammatically as shown below. Teacher, entity instance, 1001, Rajiv, address and department. Similarly, we represent the attributes of entity instance. We have represented the attributes of entity instances. We need to create a relationship between these two. We are going to create a relationship. Here we have created a relationship between teacher and student. This is termed as relationship instance. Entity type shall become the name of the table. Attribute types shall become the field names of the table diagrammatically as shown below. Teacher. Teacher is entity type. Teacher ID. Entity. Attribute type. Name attribute type. Address attribute type. And department attribute type. Student is an entity. Enrollment number is attribute type. Name is attribute type. Address is attribute type. And course is attribute type. We represent like this. Now we can create a relationship between these two entities. And the name of the relationship is teaches. We are going to create a relationship between these two entity types. Teacher teaches student. We have created a relationship between these two entities. Now, teacher becomes the name of the table. Entity type becomes the name of the table. Entity attributes, they become the fields of the table. Entity becomes the name of the table. Here it is teacher and here it is student. Entity type shall become the name of the table. Attribute types shall become the field names of the table diagrammatically as shown below. Now this entity type becomes the name of the table and these entity attributes, they become the different fields of the table. Teacher entity type becomes the name of the table. Similarly, entity type becomes the name of the table here also. Entity attributes, they become the field of the table. Here you can see that teacher ID, it becomes the first field of the table. Name becomes the second field of the table. Address, this is entity attribute, it becomes the third field of the table. Department, it is entity attribute, it becomes the fourth field of the table. Similarly, in the second case, where we have a student entity, we have entity attributes. These are enrollment number. Enrollment number becomes the first field of the table. Name, attribute of the entity type, it becomes the second field. Address, attribute of entity type, it becomes the third field. Course, attribute of entity type student, it becomes the fourth field. Here you can see one thing, that the entity type becomes the name of the table, and the attributes of entity type, they become the fields of the table. Now the attributes of entity instance shall become the row of the table diagrammatically as shown below. Teacher entity instance. How do we know that this is the entity instance? This is not in uppercase. If it is not in uppercase, then this is an instance. 1001 Rajiv, A2 Model Town, Commerce. All these are attributes of entity instance. Similarly, in the case of student entity instance, these are the attributes of entity instance. We represent it like this. Now we need to create a relationship. We name this relationship as teaches. This is relationship instance because it is not in uppercase. We have created a relationship between two entity instances, teacher and student. In this particular case, the attributes of entity instance, they become the values in particular row. We have written here attributes of entity instance shall become row of the table. Now these are the attributes, these are the different attributes of entity instance. It becomes the row of the table. Similarly, it will happen in the case of student table. These are the attributes of entity instance. 101 Amit, BCom Honors, A-12 Rohini. All these are attributes of entity instance. Attributes of entity instance shall become row of the table, and the name of the table is student. Attributes of entity instance shall become row of the table diagrammatically shown below. Now we need to talk about relationship. Here we have created a relationship by combining two entity instances. From this particular entity instance, teacher entity instance, we took these attributes and it made one particular row. From the student table, we took these attributes and it became the first row. Attributes of entity instance shall become row of the table diagrammatically as shown below. Now, we need to talk about how do we create a relationship between these two tables. In order to establish a relationship between these two entities, in the teacher table, we declare teacher ID as primary key. In the student table, we have teacher ID as foreign key. If a particular field is primary key in one particular table, and if that field is present in the second table and represented as foreign key, then these two tables are joined together. The DBMS follows a technique in which if we declare a field as primary key in one table and that field is also present in the second table as foreign key, then DBMS creates a link between these two tables. Now these two tables, teacher table and student table, these two tables are linked to each other. Linked to each other means now these two tables are connected, and with one particular query we can fetch some data from teacher table. Within the same query we can fetch data from the student table. It means in one query we can fetch data from these two tables. So we have learned in the ER model, basically there are three important components. One is entity, second is attributes, and the third one is relationship. On the basis of these three components, the whole ER model works. Thank you very much.